The storm and the silent Seth Ocean was calm that morning, its surface smooth as polished glass, reflecting the pale blue sky over the eastern coast. Ethan Whitmore, tall and broad-shouldered, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, adjusted the sails of his yacht with practiced hands. The vessel, named Serena after his late mother, had been his escape for years until Claire came into his life. Claire, with her sun-kissed skin and laughter that carried on the wind, had changed everything. She had been studying marine biology when they met, her passion for the ocean matching his own. Now, 7 months pregnant, she reclined against the deck, her hands resting on the curve of her belly. "This is perfect," she murmured, her voice soft. "Just you, me, and this little one." Ethan knelt beside her, pressing his palm against her stomach. A faint kick answered him, and his chest tightened. "He's strong," he said, grinning. Or she, Claire teased, tilting her face toward the sun. For days, the voyage was everything they had dreamed of: quiet coves, dolphins dancing alongside the boat, nights spent under a sky so full of stars it felt endless. But the ocean was never predictable. On the 8th day, the sky darkened. The wind howled, tearing at the sails. Waves, towering and furious, slammed against the hull. Ethan fought to steady the boat, but the storm was relentless. Claire's face paled as she clutched the railing. "Ethan, something's wrong." Her contractions came fast, too early. Panic clawed at his throat as he helped her below deck, the boat rocking violently. "Just hold on," he whispered, gripping her hand. "Just hold on." But the storm had other plans. Hours later, exhausted and trembling, Ethan held his newborn son for the first time. Chris was tiny, his cries fragile, but alive. Claire smiled weakly, her fingers brushing the baby's cheek. "He's beautiful," she breathed. Then the light in her eyes dimmed. "Claire," Ethan's voice cracked. "Claire, look at me." Her hand fell slack. The storm raged on, but inside that cabin, the world had gone silent. When the Coast Guard found them, Ethan was still holding Chris, his face hollow, his body numb. Claire was wrapped in blankets, her skin already cold, back on land. The house they had prepared for their child felt like a tomb. Chris cried endlessly, his tiny fists clenched, his face red with anguish. Nothing Ethan did soothed him. Nurses, nannies, specialists, no one could calm the baby's grief. Until Grace arrived. She wasn't supposed to touch him, wasn't supposed to go upstairs. But when she heard Chris's Crisra, aching, full of a loss he couldn't understand, climbed the steps anyway, and for the first time since the storm, Chris stopped crying. Grace Ramirez wasn't supposed to be in the nursery. She had been hired to clean the first floor, dust the shelves, mop the hardwood, wipe the windows until they gleamed. No bedrooms, no touching personal items, except absolutely no interaction. With the baby, those were the rules. But rules had never stopped Grace before. She stood in the doorway, her fingers gripping the mop handle as Chris's cries echoed down the hall. It wasn't the usual fussy whimper of a hungry or tired infant. This was something deeper, something raw, sound she recognized, one she had heard too. As many times in the orphanage where she grew up, grief Grace set the mop aside and climbed the stairs, her bare feet silent against the wood. The nursery door was slightly ajar. Inside, Chris lay in his crib, his tiny face flushed, his fists clenched as he wailed. Ethan was nowhere in sight, probably passed out from exhaustion. In another room, Grace hesitated. She knew she shouldn't be here. But then Chris's cries hitched, his breath catching in that desperate, gasping way that made her chest ache. She stepped inside. Pequego, she murmured, lifting him gently. His body was tense, his limbs stiff with frustration. Lie. Cradled him against her chest, humming softly a lullaby she remembered from her own childhood. One the nuns used to sing when storms kept the children awake. Chris's cries faltered. His dark eyes, so much like Ethan's, blinked up at her. Wet with tears, Grace carried him downstairs to the kitchen, where the warmth of the stove still lingered. She filled a basin with warm water and let the faucet drip into it, the rhythmic plink-plink mimicking the sound of rain. Then she sat in the rocking chair by the window, Chris curled against her and sang, "Sleep, little one, where the waves are slow, where the moon pulls the tides soft and low." By the time Ethan stumbled into the kitchen, drawn by the unfamiliar, silence, Chris was asleep, peacefully. His tiny fingers curled around Grace's thumb. Ethan froze in the doorway. Grace looked up, her dark eyes meeting his. She didn't apologize, didn't explain, just pressed a finger to her lips. Quiet. Ethan's throat tightened. He had tried everything, rocking, singing, pacing the halls for hours. Doctors had assured him Chris was healthy. Nannies had insisted. He was just colicky. But Grace had done in minutes what no one else could. "How?" he whispered. Grace only shook her head slightly, her gaze dropping back to Chris. He just needed to feel safe. Ethan didn't understand. But for the first time since the storm, he felt like he could breathe. The unspoken shift after that. Grace's role in the house changed. Ethan began asking her to stay longer, just to help with Chris when the nights grew too heavy. She never complained, never asked for more money. She simply did. With a quiet certainty that left no room for argument, Chris stopped crying himself hoarse. Dumdy began sleeping longer stretches, his tiny body relaxing in Grace's arms in a way it never did for anyone else. He would only take his bottle from her, only settle when she sang. Ethan watched, equal parts grateful and unnerved. One evening, as Grace rocked Chris by the fireplace, Ethan finally asked the question that had been burning in his chest. "Where did you learn to do this?" Grace didn't look up. "Life teaches you things," she said softly. "When you grow up with nothing, you learn how to give everything." Ethan frowned. "You grew up in an orphanage." She nodded. "And I worked in homes, hospitals, anywhere there were children who needed holding."
What?
Ethan's chest ached. In his world, a world of wealth, of pedigrees, of people who measured worth in degrees and connections, Grace was an anomaly. She had no formal training, no certificates, just an instinct deeper than education, and yet she had given his son what no one else could. That night, as Ethan lay in bed, listening to the distant sound of Grace singing to Chris, he realized something terrifying. He needed her. Not just for Chris, for himself, the arrival of Margaret, but peace never lasted. 3 weeks after Grace arrived, Ethan's mother, Margaret Whitmore, swept into the house like a winter storm. She was elegance incarnate, pearls at her throat, a tailored coat, lips painted the same deep red as the roses she brought for Chris's nursery. Her gaze landed on Grace immediately. And who is this? Grace, holding Chris, instinctively tightened her grip. Ethan stepped forward. "Grace, she helps with Chris." Margaret's smile was polished. How kind of her. That night, over dinner, Margaret's true thoughts emerged. "Ethan, darling," she said, sipping her wine. "That girl, she's the cleaner, isn't she?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "She's more than that." Margaret set her glass down. "I'm sure she's lovely. Chris needs a proper nanny. Someone educated. Someone suitable." Grace, passing by the doorway with a basket of laundry, heard every word. She didn't react, but that night, she folded Chris's tiny clothes. Her hands trembled. Not a cleaner. She had heard it before. She had always known her place, but this time... Grace had spent her entire life learning how to disappear. She knew how to fold herself into the background, how to move through rooms without being noticed. It was a skill honed in orphanages, in the homes of wealthy families where she was hired. Help always present, never truly seen. But Chris refused to let her vanish. The morning after Margaret's arrival, Grace deliberately kept to the kitchen, scrubbing counters with more force than necessary. She didn't go upstairs, didn't linger near the nursery. She followed the rules now, the way she should have from the beginning. Yet within an hour, Chris's cries pierced the house like a siren. Margaret swept into the kitchen, her mouth a tight line. "He won't settle. The nanny I hired is quite experienced," she says. "He's simply being difficult." Grace kept her eyes on the sink. Some babies just need time to adjust. Margaret's gaze sharpened. Or perhaps he's grown accustomed to the wrong kind of attention. Grace's Hands stilled. The words were a blade, precise and cruel. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his shirt rumpled, dark circles under his eyes. "Grace, could you?" Margaret cut in. "Ethan, really? We have a professional here now." Grace didn't wait for the argument. She dried her hands and walked out. But Chris's cries followed her, growing more desperate, till they were the only sound in the house. The breaking point. 3 days passed like this. Grace cleaned. The new nanny, a stern woman with a clipboard and a degree in child development, tried and failed to calm Chris. Ethan watched. He watched Grace move through the house like a ghost, her usual warmth dimmed. He watched Chris refuse to eat, his tiny face pinched with distress. He watched his mother's satisfied smile every time Grace flinched at a backhanded compliment. On the 4th night, he found Grace in the laundry room, folding Chris's tiny socks with mechanical precision. "You're leaving," he said. Wasn't a question. Grace didn't look up. "I think it's best." "For who?" Her hands paused. "For Chris. He needs to adjust to his new nanny, to his grandmother, too." "The way things should be?" Ethan stepped closer. "In what way is that?" Grace finally met his eyes. "You know the answer? I don't belong here." Something in Ethan's chest cracked. "You're the only one he wants," he said roughly. Grace shook her head. "Oh, forget me. Babies do." Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing hers over the folded socks. "I won't." The air between them thickened. Grace's breath hitched. Then the baby monitor crackled to life. Chris's cries, hoarse and heartbroken. Grace pulled away. "You should go to him." Ethan didn't move. "Come with me." Grace hesitated. "Your mother isn't his parent," Ethan snapped, and quieter. "Neither of us knows what we're doing, but you. You see him, in a way no one else does." Grace closed her eyes. She knew this was a mistake. Knew she was setting herself up for worse pain later, but Chris's cries were a hook in her heart. Pulling her forward, she followed Ethan upstairs. The truth in the dark, the nursery was bathed in moonlight. Chris stood in his crib, his tiny fists gripping the bars, tears streaming down his face. The new nanny hovered uselessly nearby. Grace didn't wait for permission. She crossed the room and lifted Chris into her arms. He buried his face in her neck. His sobs muffled against her skin. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her silk robe pristine. "This is ridiculous." Ethan turned to her. "Enough." Margaret blinked. "Excuse me? You heard me?" Ethan's voice was low, dangerous. "Grace stays. If you can't accept that, you know where the door is." Margaret's face went pale. "You're choosing a maid over family?" Ethan looked at Grace the way Chris had already quieted. In her arms, his breath evening out. "I'm choosing what's best for my son." Margaret left the next morning. Grace didn't celebrate. She simply held Chris a little tighter, her cheek resting against his soft hair, and when Ethan reached for her hand, she let him take it. The days after Margaret's departure were quiet, fragile like the first thin ice of winter, beautiful but treacherous. Grace moved through the house with less hesitation now, though she still avoided the grand sitting room where Margaret's perfume lingered in the curtains. Chris, freed from the tension, blossomed. He babbled nonsense words, his tiny hands reaching for Grace's face whenever she sang to him. He had started to crawl, his clumsy movements sending him bumping into furniture, his laughter ringing through the halls. Ethan watched it all with a quiet awe, but the world outside the house had not forgotten them. The knock at the door. Grace was in the garden with Chris. When the social worker arrived, she had set him on a blanket in the grass, letting him tug at the petals of a daisy, his face scrunched in fascination. The morning sun warmed her shoulders as she knelt beside him, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. Then the back door opened. Ethan stood there, his expression unreadable. "Grace, there's someone here to see you." Grace's stomach dropped. Inside, a woman in a crisp blazer waited in the foyer. Her smile was professional, her eyes sharp. "Ms. Ramirez, his child, and family services. We received an anonymous concern about Christopher's care." Grace's fingers curled into her palms. Ethan stepped forward. "This is ridiculous." Chris is perfectly healthy. Laura's gaze flicked to Grace, I'm sure, but given Ms. Ramirez's lack of formal childcare credentials, we're required to assess the situation. Grace felt the words like a physical blow. Lack of credentials. She had heard it before, in different ways, from different mouths. She lifted her chin. What would you like to know? The question's Laura's interrogation was methodical. How long? Have you worked here? What is your experience with infants? Do you have any certifications in early childhood development? Grace answered honestly, her voice steady even as her hands trembled. Then Laura asked the question that mattered. Are you related to Christopher in any way? Grace's throat tightened. No. Laura's pen hovered over her clipboard. Yet you've taken on a primary caregiving role, Ethan cut in, because I asked her to. Laura turned to him. Mr. Whitmore, you're a grieving father. It's understandable to seek help, but we must ensure that help is qualified. Grace stood abruptly. I'll show you my room. Laura followed her to the small staff quarters, neat, sparse, nothing personal except a single photo tucked under the pillow. Grace pulled it out before Laura could see, a faded picture of the orphanage sisters who had raised her. Laura's expression softened slightly. You care about him? Grace didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded. The ultimatum after Laura left, promising a follow-up visit. Ethan found Grace packing. Her movements were quick, efficient. She folded the few clothes she owned, tucked the orphanage photo into her bag. Ethan blocked the doorway. Where are you going? Grace kept her eyes on her hands. You heard her? I'm not qualified. I'm not family. You're his family, Ethan said fiercely. You're mine. The word hung between them, unspoken but deafening. Grace finally looked at him. Ethan, be honest. If I stay, this will never end. The scrutiny, the doubts. I'll always be the maid who overstepped. Ethan crossed the room in 2 strides, his hands gripping her shoulders. Then let me fix it. Grace frowned. How? His breath was unsteady. Marry me. Grace's heart stopped. Ethan rushed on, his voice rough. Not for real. Legal arrangement. You'd have rights to Chris. No one could question your place here. Grace recoiled. You'd marry me out of pity. No. Ethan's grip tightened. Because I can't lose you, either of you. The air between them crackled. Grace searched his face, the desperation in his eyes. The way his thumb brushed her collarbone like she was something precious. She knew she should refuse. Knew this was a line that once crossed could never be uncrossed. But then Chris's cry echoed. Down the hall. Grace closed her eyes. Okay, she whispered. The courthouse wedding was a quiet affair. Grace wore a simple cream-colored dress, something she had bought years ago for a friend's wedding and never worn. Ethan stood stiffly in a charcoal suit, his jaw clenched as the judge recited the vows. Chris, balanced on Grace's hip, chewed on the edge of her sleeve, oblivious to the gravity of the moment. When it was time to exchange rings, Ethan slid a plain gold band onto Grace's finger. His hands were warm, his touch lingering. Just a second too long. With this ring, he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear, I promise to protect you. Both of you. Grace's breath caught. It wasn't a real vow, not the kind whispered between lovers, but it felt like one. The return to the house, the staff had been told the marriage was a practical arrangement. No one believed it. Grace saw the way the housekeeper's lips pursed when she set a place for Grace at the dining table. Heard the muttered climbing the ladder from the gardener as she passed. Even the new nanny now, necessary, left with a venomous glare. Grace tried to ignore it. She focused on Chris, on the way he now toddled after her with unsteady steps, his laughter echoing through the halls. But at night, when the house was silent, she lay awake in her new room, the master bedroom. Though she and Ethan had an unspoken agreement that she would sleep in the adjoining nursery with Chris, it was easier that way. Safer. The first cracked. The first time Ethan touched her without thinking. It was an accident. Grace was bent over Chris's crib, adjusting his blanket, when Ethan reached past her to straighten the mobile. His chest brushed against her back, his breath warm on her neck. They both froze. Grace's pulse roared in her ears. Ethan's hand hovered near her waist, close enough that she could feel the heat of his skin through the thin fabric of her niche TGOWN. Then Chris stirred, and the moment shattered. Ethan stepped back, clearing his throat. I'll let you rest. Grace didn't trust herself to speak. She nodded, her fingers gripping the crib rail until her knuckles turned white. The dinner party, Margaret. His friends were less subtle in their disdain. The dinner party had been Ethan's idea, a way to normalize their marriage in society's eyes. But Grace felt their stares like physical weights as she took her seat at the head of the table. How interesting that you two found each other, Mrs. Harrington mused, swirling her wine. And so soon after Claire's passing, Grace's fork clattered against her plate. Ethan's hand found hers under the table, his grip firm. Grace has been a blessing to Chris, and to me. Now, the room went uncomfortably quiet. Later, when the guests had left and Chris was asleep, Grace finally broke. This was a mistake. Ethan turned to her, his tie loosened, his eyes shadowed. What was this? Grace gestured between them, pretending. Can't I won't be the woman who replaced Claire. Can't I's expression darkened. You haven't replaced anyone? Then what am I? Her voice cracked. A nanny? A maid? A wife in name only? Ethan closed the distance between them in 2 strides. His hands cradled her face, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. You're Grace, he said roughly. The woman who saved my son. The woman He stopped himself. Grace's heart pounded. You what? Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips. And then, finally, he kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, hungry. Years of grief and longing poured into a single touch. Grace melted against him, her fingers tangling in his hair, the gold band. On her finger gleaming in the dim light, when they finally pulled apart, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. Stay, he whispered. Not for Chris, for me. Grace closed her eyes. For the first time in her life, she let herself want. Okay. She breathed. Epilogue. The shoreline a year later. They stood on the deck of the Serena, the yacht Ethan hadn't sailed since the storm. Chris, now a running, chattering toddler, clung to Grace's leg as she pointed out dolphins in the distance. His laughter was bright, unburdened. Ethan wrapped his arms around them both, his chin resting on Grace's shoulder. No regrets? He murmured. Grace turned her head, pressing a kiss to his jaw. Not one. And as the boat cut through the waves, the ocean stretching endlessly before them, Grace realized something. She was no longer the woman who heard grief. She was the woman who taught a broken family how to love again.